So Robert Horn, I would like to thank you for joining us here at Cultural Attaché. For those who don't know you by name, you are the Tony Award-winning screenwriter of the musical Tootsie, which is currently on tour.
Correct, not screenwriter, book writer.
Book writer, yes. Sorry, there's
Teri Garr and Don McGuire were the lovely screenwriters.
Yes, and Murray Shiskel. Yeah.
Murray Shiskel and Elaine May, and a lot of people I think that maybe weren't credited.
Of course. But Dustin Hoffman thinks it was all Murray Shiskel. But that's another thing.
I don't get involved in that conversation.
But I do know that you were a fan of Larry Gelbart's, and I'm wondering how daunting it was tackling this film that has been so beloved for so long.
Of course, it's very daunting. I've made no secret of the fact that when they first approached me about it, I had a lot of trepidation, and I actually said no because I was terrified for a number of reasons. But I was terrified of it, and it is sort of as we've progressed as a society, the flaws in the storytelling of the movie have made themselves a little more evident. But at the time, it truly was a perfect comedy in many ways, and so and existed in a certain format that it existed in, and so to alter that, to change it, is really scary. And you also question, can it work in a different genre, in a different artistic format, and am I the person to do that, and all those things. So yeah, it was scary. It was very scary.
How did you overcome that question of, am I the right person to do it?
Well, interestingly enough, the producer, Scott Sanders, who had the rights from his years at working at Sony, approached me about it. And I was working on another project with him, and I was in New York doing a 1-week workshop on something else. And he had asked me to meet on this. And I said, I sort of passed on it. And he said, you're in New York on my dime, you're taking the meeting. So I had to take the meeting. And truthfully, what turned me on it was David Yazbek, because I sat with David, and I actually went in saying, I'm going to blow this meeting. I'm going to tell them everything that I would want to do, which is so different than in many ways than the film, and how I would want to approach it in a more contemporary way, and what I would want to change. And David just embraced all of it. He held on to nothing from the movie and wanted to make it his own as well. And I was such a fan of his work. I mean, for so long, Dirty Rotten Scoundrels and Full Monty and Woman on the Verge, and and his albums. I loved David, and I took the meeting because I wanted to meet David Yazbek, and we found this brethren in that room together artistically, and we just clicked, and we knew at that moment that we could, if we stuck to the DNA of the story. Because for me, what I loved about the idea of doing it, and what I related to in this, is how tough this business is, and how we often are our own worst enemy. And what would you do if somebody said to you, you can't ever do the thing you love more than anything? If somebody told me I could no longer write, what would I do to push past that and make it happen? And I related to that. And I think we both felt if we could hold on to that as the thread and then rebuild the story to work in a different medium, we were onto something.
Obviously, placing Michael Dorsey or Dorothy Michaels in a musical was a very logical step, since you are in a musical. You didn't want to musicalize it. You didn't want to musicalize a soap opera, although you did have to get rid of the line House Cleveland.
I had to get rid. Here, I'll tell you two things. One, the idea of doing a television show on stage felt a little meta. It felt a little like, it's really hard to do, with camera. It takes you sort of out of the idea that you're in a musical. And when you're writing a musical, the first thing you always ask yourself is, what makes this a musical? Why does this sing? Usually it's because the story is so much larger than life, or the way you present the story is so emotional, or so much larger than life, that it warrants that art form. And for us, it was like, well, it's very organic. You make it a musical, there's a reason for the music to be there. And so that had a lot to do with it. Also, truthfully, soap operas in the 80s was such a major form of communication to women, both in and out of the workplace. And it had such a vast reach that it doesn't have anymore. Soap operas sort of are kind of irrelevant now. There's new forms of soap operas. I think TikTok is it's a soap opera in its own way. I think the world has changed. So it didn't make sense to tell the story now with that format.
Well, and soap operas have become the Real Housewives of insert name of city here.
They have. That's the crazy thing about soap operas now is you used to watch soap operas as an observer and sit there and say, oh my God, thank God my life isn't that. Now, soap operas are everybody. Everybody feels like they're in that soap opera because the reality shows have taken it to a whole different, it changes generationally, I guess. But yes, so that's really why we changed it.
You brought up the idea that why do they sing in a musical like this? And I love the fact that Dorothy Michaels' big reveal at the end is not a song. Were there discussions about whether that moment should be musicalized?
There's discussions about every moment and what should be musicalized, and often that comes from the composer and what they feel, what they connect to. You can't write a song if you don't connect to it, and so that moment, what David really wisely, I think, decided was, let's musicalize everything up to that moment and let that moment be a scene because they're in a play. Because the music is sort of stopped in the play, and to continue it, it confuses you. She singing? Are they singing in the play? Are they saying so it was really about making sure that there was no confusion as to what was going on. But up until that moment, he sings.
Right. You were able to put in, more contemporary references into both the script and into the lyrics in this musical. What are the challenges in updating a property in a way that it too can be timeless and not then need revisions later? If the world rediscovers Tootsie in 20 years, that some of those ideas don't become antiquated by the time that happens.
That's a great question. I think the first thing you do, and what you'll notice in our Tootsie, is that there really aren't any contemporary references in terms of political or pop culture. There's very few, if any, references to that. So that in itself will sort of take it out of a very specific era in a sense. The references we do make that are political are more about the issues that are brought up about feminism and what it is for a cis man, somebody who identifies as male, to take on the experience and identity of somebody they are not, and what that means in the world of feminism and how we're changing culturally. So those, I don't know where we'll be with those elements 10 years from now, and we may feel very dated 10 years from now when there's a woman president and when the world has changed. So, but we decided if we were going to put anything contemporary in, it would be those issues that the story itself struggles with. But other than that, I think you just make the comedy feel as universal. I think the commerce of this show is the comedy. We really wanted to. I always believe, and I don't know that everybody always agrees with me, but I believe you can open minds and create conversation if you can make people laugh. I don't think people want to be lectured to. I don't think they want to be yelled at. I think people want inherently to communicate and to understand each other. And I think comedy is a great gateway to get us to that. So for us, it was about how do we make it as funny as we can make it without ignoring the elephants in the room and what the story is actually about. So I think hopefully in that way, we made it feel somewhat universal or somewhat at least timeless.
There's been a lot that women have written about Tootsie over the years.
Wow.
But the thing that always amazed me is that whatever the criticisms were about, a man taking a job away from a woman, a straight man having to be the savior for women, other elements that they had issue with, they still agreed that the movie did entertain and did have something to offer. So how large was that mountain to climb to address those issues?
It was very large. It was very large, and it shifted as we were writing it. The sort of the nucleus of the Me Too movement really came to fruition in the middle of writing this show. And so it was very much in the forefront. The producers were one. I talked to the producers and I said, I don't think I can navigate this alone. I identify as a male. I mean, I see myself as both having both male and female energy. I'm a gay man. I was raised by all women. I very much, but I also, I have not lived that experience. And so producers were very generous in, I did a lot of work with GLAAD. I did a lot of work with women on the forefront of the feminist movement to talk to them and explain to me what I don't know. I would talk to I had very open communication with the women involved in the production, both on the stage and off, to help me navigate that. I think, once you understand what you don't understand, you can use your talent to make it funny, to you bring your voice to it, but you have to know what it is you're writing. And so it was very daunting and very scary, but we made some very strong decisions. One, that unlike the movie, the women will not become better women by virtue of this man dressing as a woman. He will become a better person by being surrounded by the women in the piece. So we definitely looked at the lead characters, the Julie character and the Rita character, and the characters that in the movie felt a little victimized or felt sort of oppressed by men in some ways, and gave them much more of a life and a story where they were independent women, that they didn't have to explain themselves to anybody. And that Michael as a character, by virtue of being around these women, learned and became a better person, and not the other way around. So that was really important to me and David, to establish that. And then I think the other thing is that we work very hard to never get our comedy from a man being dressed as a woman. That's not where we never make jokes about that. That is not part of our comedy. The comedy comes from the mistakes he's making and the hole he digs himself in, and the fact that he's falling in love with somebody and he's lying.
Well, the interesting thing is, RuPaul's Drag Race couldn't have been more popular, and who would have foreseen that at a time when you're putting a man in dress on a stage?
The trope of cross-dressing, as it were, has existed for centuries. For better or worse, there are things about it that I think what Drag Race has done, and what hopefully we try to do, is to bring that trope into a new era, so we understand it and see it differently. And if it's done correctly, it should, as long as it's done to celebrate and never or to learn, I think you're okay. It's when you do, obviously there's a history of cross-dressing that often became the brunt of a joke, and I think that can't exist anymore. So we worked really hard to try to do that. To whatever degree we accomplished it, I hope we did. We feel like one of the things that I did was I took the character of Jeff, who in the movie was Bill Murray, and I sort of elevated that character to be the voice of the audience, to say, what are you doing? This is a generation where women are clutching back their power, and you are perpetrating somebody else's experience and taking a job away that does not belong to you. And so we try to hit those things head on, to say we understand that this happens in the world, and this is happening in our story, and what are we going to learn from that?
Right. Now, you mentioned that it was about what a man can learn, and Larry Gelbart felt that the cornerstone of the whole movie was the line in his last scene with Julie in the park or on the street, where he says, "I was a better man with you as a woman than I ever was with a woman as a man." Yet that line is not in, at least in the script that I read, which is the touring script.
Yes, it was in the show on Broadway early on, and then I took it out because, for a number of reasons. I think the world has progressed to we're at a place where we view gender differently. So and I love the sentiment of that for when it was written. But to say you're a better man or a better woman by virtue of a different sex, I feel we view that through a different lens now. And I just didn't think it had the gravitas that it had at the time. I wanted to respect the ending of the movie, which was quiet. It wasn't, I didn't David and I both felt we didn't want to go out like on a big production number and suddenly they're in love. And not everybody agrees with this, but I ended the piece not knowing whether this was going to be their last conversation ever or the beginning of a different kind of relationship. I wanted the audience to decide that for themselves. I just wanted to make sure that Michael started to understand the huge mistake he had made in many ways and started to change and learn how his actions affected other people, both in terms of his lies and how he perpetrated somebody else's identity. So it wasn't important to me that the audience felt comfortable with they're going to kiss and be together. That I felt we had them, hopefully we have them laughing all night. Let's build to a place that felt honest and say, sometimes relationships work out, sometimes they don't, but at least say you're sorry. You see, interestingly, in the movie, he never says he's sorry. He says, I was a better man, all that stuff, but he never says, I'm sorry. And it was really important to me that he did. And it was really important to me that she doesn't forgive him. And he says, she says, what do you want? What do you want me to do? And he says, I will listen. Because I think we're in an era now where men who have had the power for so long need to just shut up and listen. Let's listen because we don't know. Anyway, that's sort of where all that grew out of. That was a long sentence. I apologize.
That's all right. He doesn't directly apologize, but he does say to Julie, "I never meant to hurt you," which is in the musical as well.
He actually, yeah, he does. But I wanted him to say the words, "I am so sorry," because there's nothing else to say other than "I am so sorry. I am sorry," and right. So that was important to me.
One of my favorite changes is that Max is a contemporary and not a lecherous old man.
Yes.
Which I guess that's part of the time we live in, but it also makes it more interesting that it's a contemporary. Yeah. How much does Max serve as a counterpoint to Michael?
That's a very interesting question, because Max is in many ways the bane of Michael's frustrations and existence. Because Michael, as you learn early on, he is an a-hole. He is arrogant and he is petulant and he's all those things, but he's also right because he's a really good actor and he's a really smart actor. And the one thing he has no tolerance for is bad acting or bad directing, and it's all about the craft. And so here comes this guy who it's clear they cast to sell tickets, who does not have craft. And so he is the bane of Michael's existence in that way. But one of the reasons I really wanted to make that change was I love the idea of creating a character who is viewed as who the world has a certain perception of because of what they look like and who they are, who secretly actually has the desire to be more. And by being around a company of actors, by being around people who do love their craft, that our world in the world of theater is such an insular world, and it's such a craft-driven world. I live in LA and I deal a lot in film and television, and I feel that there's a very different approach to the art form in the two cities. And theater is so much, because you make no money and it's so much work, there's such a sense of community. And I wanted to bring somebody from the outside into that and learn, not just through Michael, but through being in that production, what it means to be the member of a company and to actually see that maybe you have talent past how you identify yourself because the world sees you a certain way. So I thought all those elements sort of played into each other in terms of the gender issues and those issues. They all sort of tied together.
This project was first announced in 2012. Which is a long time ago.
I heard.
David Zippel, Walter, I don't even know how to say his last name, Afanasieff, Barry Manilow, Bruce Sussman, Tom Meehan. Then there was discussions of Pasek and Paul and, all kinds of other people who were circling around this project. Why do you think it took so much time to land on the right team and ultimately have a show that could work, that could go on stage?
I think that is a credit to the producers, Scott Sanders and Carol Feineman. I think often you put a team together, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. when that happens, sometimes it's all about how society changes, and are we telling is this still working with how we're telling the story? Sometimes it's personality conflicts. It's a very weird thing because you're thrown together with a group of creative people and you're suddenly in a marriage, because you're in this world where you have to be able to be so vulnerable and so open to exposing yourself in order to in order to create, because you have to come from a place of honesty. And sometimes that works, sometimes it doesn't. I think there are a lot of reasons why many incarnations of this didn't work. I don't know a lot of them. When I came into this, I didn't want to know the history of it. I felt like I wanted to. I know that there had been another, like somebody had written the first act of it prior. I didn't want to read it. I didn't want to know. I wanted to come to it clean. So for whatever, all I can say is I'm grateful it worked out the way it did.
Yeah, it's nice to have that Tony Award as an example of all the work you did, isn't it?
It's a lot of work, and for me, that was just having been in this business for so many years and struggling for so many years. And I had started off in I was born and raised, grew up in New York, wanted to be a playwright, couldn't get a job, came out to LA, somehow managed to get this career in television and film that I didn't expect, but always, my heart was always just theater. I love theater, musical theater. And I worked so hard to try to get back into that world. And when I finally did, it was sort of an acknowledgement of the years of not giving up, just to finally feel like you're accepted within a very, very a wonderful community and very supportive community.
Right.
It was an amazing thing. It was a bucket list thing, and when it happened, and then the next day you're like, well, now I need a job. So it's a wonderful thing, but you start off every day. You start off on page one.
Right. Or as Sondheim says at the opening of Sunday in the Park with George, a blank canvas.
A blank page or canvas, so many possibilities.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's every day is scary and daunting.
Right. I would have to think that going into a project that's based on a popular film, particularly for a musical, is something where it's more daunting a prospect than maybe creating something new, because there is a graveyard of musicals based on movies. Yeah, whether it's Breakfast at Tiffany's or Victor, Victoria, Arthur, Nick and Nora, and I know you worked with Jason Robert Brown on 13, Honeymoon in Vegas, which I think happened to have been a really fun, entertaining show, but somehow, and unfortunately Tootsie was one of those, didn't quite succeed, at the box office. And I'm wondering, what's the one thing you learned from adapting a film into a musical that you think is a cardinal rule that other people who are endeavoring to do the same thing should know?
Wow. I don't think there is a cardinal rule. You don't know. I do. There's a pattern. I'm not a designer, but I see a pattern, as I like to say. There's the interesting thing that the shows that have become successful from movies are lesser known movies. You look at you look at Hairspray, you look at any Waitress. They're movies that most people in the populace don't really know. They're niche movies. I think when you have a huge title, there's such an association to something. For me, I can only speak for myself, and I think different shows do it different ways. I knew I wanted to keep, again, as I say, the DNA of the story, but not lock myself to anything from the movie. I didn't want to put my name on something that someone else had written. And so I love, like I said, I idolized Larry Gelbart and everybody and McGuire and everybody that was involved in it, but I didn't want to take credit for their work. So for me, it was about making my own, but also paying homage to what existed. But I think the challenge is, it's really hard when people associate something. I'm sure people came to Tootsie and wanted the Cleveland line and didn't get it. And so I think it's really hard to say. My job, I felt, was in the first 5 minutes, make them forget the movie and forget that stellar cast. And we had our own stellar cast, as does the tour have a stellar cast, and make them forget that and invest in your story in the way you're telling it. I don't know that there's a rule. I think people will keep trying. I think producers in the current environment we're in, where the costs to do a musical are so high, go into it hoping for some sort of recognition factor that will sell tickets early on, and popular brands do that. I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. You look at Hamilton, which was based on a book and that nobody read other than Lin-Manuel, and it changed the art form. So I have a new original musical coming in that was is based on just an idea, and that has taken us many years to write, which I love. And I'm also doing more movie adaptations. So I think it's about how you make it your own, but I don't think there's a formula. I think people will either come to it or they won't. They'll either, we got great reviews from Tootsie. I mean, you would kill for those reviews, and yet when people would come to see it, they loved it. People would leave the theater loving it. Getting somebody into the theater is really hard, and for whatever reason. So I don't know why they work or where they don't. I've seen musical adaptations that I thought were brilliant that didn't work, and I'm like, I don't understand why.
Well, I think you're onto something with the idea of relying on a pre-sold property as the way to get people in, because you're also risking disappointing them, which may be the factor. And I will tell you a quick story, because I did get a chance to interview Larry Gelbart once. And I asked him about Mrs. Doubtfire, which of course just reopened in New York. But we were talking about the film then, for obvious reasons, since Gelbart passed before the musical happened. And he said, "Oh, Mrs. Doubtfire, you mean Tootsie versus Kramer?"
That's really, yeah. He's right. He was right.
He's absolutely right.
Yeah.
The script that I read, Robert, says touring production. So I'm wondering if there were any revisions done between closing on Broadway and launching the tour.
A lot of revisions, yeah. Revisions, some out of necessity. For example, we don't have as much automation in the tour, because you have to do a tour less expensive. And so we were like, okay, how are we going to move some of these sets in and out? And Dennis Jones, our choreographer, and Dave Solomon, who is our director and was the associate director on Broadway, came up with this brilliant idea of using the ensemble as a Greek chorus to move the show in and out, but then also be the voices inside Michael's head. And it was a big change we made from the Broadway musical that works really beautifully and really helps pull the story through. Other than that, we did make changes. We made changes to the book in terms of, again, as the world was changing and addressing some of the political issues that have changed in the 3 years since it opened on Broadway. So I definitely made some changes there. As you know, as you probably saw, there are a lot of jokes in the show, and I get bored with them, so I change them up when I get the opportunity, just to breathe new life into the show and for the actors to have new material. But really, the changes that I made, there were also things that didn't work on Broadway, a joke that didn't work, or a moment that I felt wasn't as strong as it could be. And when you get the opportunity to readdress it, once you freeze a show on Broadway, it's frozen. Can't really make changes. So I was able to go in and make changes to things that had always bothered me. Nothing major, but things that I was like, oh, I could have done better.
Right, fair enough. I've long believed that Tootsie was the last film that came from sort of the Billy Wilder, I.A.L. Diamond school of comedies and films. And I'm wondering how large a shadow you think Billy Wilder and Diamond, cast over not just the film, but on this musical.
Listen, I mean, I'm a Billy Wilder fanatic. I think people don't do or understand farce anymore in a way that I think a generation of filmmakers did, especially back in the 30s and 40s. Though I think when you sit down to write a show, the first thing you ask yourself is, what is the tone? Because the tone has to tell you, will guide you throughout the whole piece. And once you know that, you have to keep coming back to what is the tone. I think it influences this show to the degree that it influences David and I. I know David is a huge fan as well. of both of them. And I think it influences us in that it influenced our artistry. And, growing up, being aware of all that whole generation of filmmaking, influenced me as a writer. Billy Wilder and Larry Gelbart and Neil Simon and Woody Allen, and I some names I shouldn't mention, but and those sorts of, and even the Toady Fields and Joan Rivers, and people, writers and comedians that really pushed the art form and changed it, and all influenced us. So I think in that respect, it influenced us. I think Tootsie is above everything else. The movie, especially, and the play, is a farce. It's a grand farce. It's a grand farce grounded in real humanity and real human emotions. But it's big and it's farce. And I love farce. I think that people have stopped embracing it or have stopped learning how to do it. I don't think it's taught in colleges anymore. I think comedy isn't taught in colleges the way drama is, the way kids graduate. There's a whole generation that's graduating from these college programs that are not equipped with the tools that you need to do great comedy, which is frustrating, and I think that should change. The same way I'm frustrated that comedies rarely win the Academy Award. I think twice they have. I think that, yes, I think we stand on the shoulder. Every generation stands on the shoulders of the artists that came before them. And I think it's our job as artists to know what came before us and to redefine that through our lens of, here's what I'll say. I think when you want to look years from now, when you want to look back at a certain time in history, you look at the art, and it will tell you everything that was going on culturally at that time. So when you look back at Billy Wilder's work, it's the same thing as when you look back at contemporary filmmakers, and it will be the same thing. So yes. Did that answer your question?
It did. It prompted a whole bunch of others, which we don't have time for, but I do want to finish by asking you about something that Billy Wilder is quoted as saying. He said, "Everyone in the audience is an idiot, but taken together, they're a genius." As only Billy Wilder could say it.
Oh, yes.
What did the audience teach you about Tootsie that will inform the work that you do moving forward?
That's a great question. On a larger scale, this is what would fascinate me. Tootsie, our Tootsie, came to light at a time when our country was becoming more and more divided, which really has broken my heart. I think people always disagreed, but stayed in the room and had the conversation. So Tootsie started to happen as I was watching these divisions starting to happen in our society. But what I would see is I would go in, I would stand in the back of the theater, and you would see people in cargo shorts and flip-flops and people in, comme de garçon gowns in the same audience. You knew you were looking at tourists from flyover states to elitists sitting in the same audience and communally laughing together at the same thing. And I think what audiences taught me about this show is that you can reach all walks of life through comedy. I literally would be moved to tears. I would sit there and go, that person and that person will never actually meet in real life. Their worlds are so different, and yet here they are in the same room, breathing that same air, laughing at the same thing, maybe for different reasons. But it was a beautiful lesson and moment for me. So I think audiences taught me that. And the other thing, every audience teaches you how to tell a story. And every show you write, you learn more about how to tell a story, where you lose an audience, where they lean forward. Those are more specific things that I could go through on this show and say, this is what I learned here. But really, as a larger theme, the fact that people really want to have a shared experience.
Even if they have a different opinion about what that shared experience is.
They have very different opinions, very different about what that shared experience is. That's art. That's how it should be. The hardest thing that we do is open ourselves up to criticism, and yet that's exactly what we have to do in order to be artists. It's you never really come to terms with that, but that's the reality.
Absolutely. Well, I wish we had, another hour to talk, because I have a feeling we could have quite the conversation, but this has been thoroughly entertaining. Thank you.